Children ask the questions adults are too polite to ask. On April 8, 1985, 9-year-old Sarah Mitchell proved it. She won tickets to The Tonight Show with her mom, sat in row 5, and when Carson asked for audience questions, she raised her hand. "What's your biggest regret?" The question was innocent. The answer destroyed him. Carson talked about his 3 sons, about choosing television over bedtime stories, about success that cost him everything that mattered. America watched their hero become human. April 8, 1985. Studio One in Burbank, California. The Tonight Show was in its 23rd year, and Johnny Carson had the routine down to a science. Monologue at 5:32 p.m. sharp during taping, first guest at 5:45, second guest at 6:05, musical performance at 6:25, and, if time permitted, a brief audience interaction segment before the final credits. The audience segment was Carson's favorite part of the show, though he rarely admitted it publicly. It was unscripted, unpredictable, a chance to connect with real people rather than celebrities promoting their latest projects. On this particular Monday evening, Carson had no idea that a 9-year-old girl in row 5 was about to ask him the one question that would crack open the carefully constructed facade he'd maintained for over 2 decades on national television. Before we go deeper into what happened that night, I need you to understand what you're about to witness. The stories in this channel aren't the sanitized myths that get repeated in entertainment documentaries or official biographies. These are the moments when the performance stopped, when the mask slipped, when Johnny Carson became the man he'd spent his entire career hiding. If you want to see the truth behind television's golden age, if you're ready to discover who these legends actually were when they couldn't hide anymore, then subscribe to this channel. Because what happened on April 8, 1985 is just the beginning of understanding who Johnny Carson really was and what it cost him to be America's most beloved entertainer. Sarah Mitchell was 9 years old, 4th grade at Riverside Elementary in Glendale, California. She lived with her mother, Patricia, a single parent who worked as a dental hygienist and watched The Tonight Show every single night after Sarah went to bed. It was Patricia's ritual, her way of decompressing after long days of managing cavities and difficult patients and the constant financial stress of raising a daughter alone. Sarah knew her mother loved Johnny Carson, knew that watching his show was the one thing that made her mom laugh after particularly hard days. So when Sarah's school held a raffle for Tonight Show tickets as part of a fundraiser, Sarah spent her entire allowance buying entries. She didn't win for herself. She won for her mom, to give Patricia something special, to say thank you for all the bedtime stories and packed lunches and late-night conversations when Sarah couldn't sleep. The taping on April 8th had gone smoothly up until the audience segment. Carson had delivered a strong monologue about President Reagan's recent trip to Europe, interviewed actress Stephanie Powers about her new TV movie, and bantered with comedian Howie Mandel about his fear of germs. The energy in the studio was good, the audience responsive, everything clicking along with the precision that came from 23 years of doing the same show 5 nights a week. At 6:28 p.m., with about 7 minutes left in the taping, Carson turned to the audience and said what he always said during these segments. "We've got a few minutes before we wrap up. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask me? Keep it clean, folks. This is a family show." Hands went up throughout the studio. Carson's eyes scanned the crowd, looking for someone interesting, someone who might provide a good moment. He saw Sarah Mitchell, this tiny girl in row 5, with her hand raised higher than anyone else's, practically bouncing in her seat with eagerness. Carson smiled, that famous Carson smile that had charmed America for decades, and pointed at her. "You there, young lady in the blue dress. What's your name, and what's your question?" Sarah stood up, and suddenly she looked very small, standing there in front of 300 people and television cameras. Her voice, when she spoke, was high and clear and carried perfectly in the studio's acoustic environment. "My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 9 years old. Mr. Carson, my teacher said we should always learn from people who are successful. So my question is, what's your biggest regret? The question hung in the air for a moment, innocent and devastating in equal measure. The audience went quiet, sensing that something unexpected had just happened, but not quite understanding what. Ed McMahon, sitting in his announcer chair, shifted uncomfortably. Doc Severinsen looked up from his trumpet, and Johnny Carson, standing center stage under the spotlight, felt something crack inside his chest. The smile stayed on Carson's face for another 3 seconds, that professional mask he'd learned to wear so perfectly that most people thought it was his actual face. Then, slowly, the smile faded. Carson looked at Sarah Mitchell, really looked at her, and saw a 9-year-old girl asking an honest question because she thought successful people had wisdom to share. She had no idea she'd just asked the one thing Carson had spent 23 years, 3 marriages, and countless sleepless nights trying not to think about. For 8 seconds, an eternity in television time, Carson stood completely still, his mouth slightly open, words failing him for the first time in his professional career. The audience waited. The crew waited. Sarah waited, starting to look worried that maybe she'd said something wrong. Finally, Carson spoke. His voice was quieter than usual, lacking the performative quality that usually characterized his on-camera presence. "Sarah, that's a very grown-up question, and it deserves an honest answer." He paused, looked down at his hands, then back at Sarah. "My biggest regret is that I prioritized this show, this career, over being present for the people who needed me most, my sons. I have 3 sons, and I missed most of their childhoods because I was here, in this studio, being Johnny Carson, the television host, instead of being their father." The studio went absolutely silent. This wasn't the kind of thing celebrities admitted in 1985, especially not during a taped television show that would air to millions of viewers. Ed McMahon's expression shifted from discomfort to concern. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether to react or stay quiet. Sarah Mitchell looked confused, like she'd expected a funny answer, or maybe something about wishing he'd bought stock in some company, not this raw confession of parental failure. But Carson wasn't done. Something had broken open in him, and now that it had started coming out, he couldn't stop it. Carson walked over to his desk and sat down, not in the performative way he usually did during interviews, but heavily, like someone who'd been standing too long and needed to rest. He looked directly at the camera, speaking not to the studio audience, but to the millions of people watching at home, and more specifically, to the 3 sons who he knew would probably see this eventually. "I thought success meant being the best at what I do, and by that measure, I succeeded. This show has been #1 in late night for most of its run. I've interviewed presidents and movie stars and cultural icons. I've won awards and accolades and achieved everything I set out to achieve professionally. But my sons grew up without me. I missed school plays and baseball games and parent-teacher conferences because I was here, working. And when I was home, I was thinking about work, preparing for the next show, reviewing the next script. I was present physically, but absent in every way that mattered." Ed McMahon, who'd known Carson for over 2 decades and had seen him through divorces and career crises and personal struggles, watched his friend unravel on live television and felt completely helpless. This wasn't something you could fix with a joke or a subject change. This was Johnny Carson finally being honest about the cost of his success, and all Ed could do was bear witness. The camera operators kept filming because no one had signaled them to stop. The director in the control room, Bobby Quinn, had his finger hovering over the button that would cut to commercial, but something told him that cutting away from this moment would be a betrayal of whatever was happening on that stage. Carson continued, his voice getting rougher as he spoke. "My oldest son is 34 years old. I don't really know him. I mean, I know facts about him, where he lives, what he does for work, but I don't know him. I don't know what makes him laugh or what keeps him up at night or what his dreams are. And that's my fault. not his. Mine. Because I made a choice every single day for 23 years to be here instead of there. I told myself I was providing for them, giving them a good life, setting an example of professional excellence. But what I was really doing was hiding behind work because it was easier than being a father, because I knew how to be Johnny Carson the entertainer, but I had no idea how to be Johnny Carson the dad. Sarah Mitchell, still standing in row 5, had tears in her eyes. This wasn't the answer she'd expected, and she looked at her mother with an expression that said she was sorry for asking the question. Patricia put her arm around Sarah, pulled her close, and mouthed to Carson that it was okay, that Sarah hadn't meant to upset him. But Carson saw Sarah's tears and immediately felt the weight of what he'd just done. He'd unloaded his personal failures onto a 9-year-old girl who'd just asked an innocent question. He stood up from his desk, walked to the edge of the stage closest to row 5, and addressed Sarah directly. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. You asked me about regret, and I gave you an honest answer. But that doesn't mean you did anything wrong. In fact, you did something incredibly important. You reminded me that success without relationships is just an expensive way to be lonely. You asked a question that adults are too scared to ask because we're all pretending we have it figured out. But you know what the truth is? None of us have it figured out. We're all just making it up as we go, and sometimes we make terrible choices that we can't undo. The only thing we can do is be honest about those choices and maybe, if we're lucky, help someone else avoid making the same mistakes." The audience started to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't Johnny Carson, the polished professional, delivering carefully crafted responses to pre-screened questions. This was a man having a public reckoning with his own life choices, using a child's innocent question as permission to finally tell the truth he'd been avoiding for decades. Several audience members were crying. Others sat in stunned silence, processing what they were hearing. The 300 people in Studio One that evening would spend the rest of their lives telling people about the night Johnny Carson stopped performing and started confessing. What happened next wasn't captured by the main cameras broadcasting to millions. During the commercial break that followed, Carson did something he'd never done in 23 years of hosting. He stepped off the stage, walked into the audience, and sat down in the empty seat next to Sarah Mitchell. The studio crew watched in confusion as America's most famous television host abandoned his mark, his lighting, his carefully choreographed position, to sit beside a 9-year-old girl who'd accidentally cracked him open. He took Sarah's small hand in his and spoke quietly, just to her, words that only the people in the immediate vicinity could hear. "Thank you for asking me that question. You're braver than most adults I know." Sarah, overwhelmed by everything happening, managed to whisper back, "I didn't mean to make you sad, Mr. Carson." Johnny shook his head. "You didn't make me sad, sweetheart. You made me honest, and that's much more valuable." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pen, took Sarah's hand, and wrote his personal phone number on her palm. "If you ever need anything, if you ever have another question, you call that number. Promise me." Sarah nodded, speechless, staring at the numbers written on her hand, like they were a secret code to another world. Patricia Mitchell watched this interaction with tears streaming down her face. She'd brought her daughter to The Tonight Show, expecting entertainment, a fun evening, maybe a story to tell at work. Instead, she was witnessing something she didn't have words for, something that felt both deeply personal and universally important. When Carson stood up to return to the stage, Patricia found her voice. "Mr. Carson, thank you for being honest with her, with all of us." Carson looked at Patricia, really looked at her, and saw a single mother working hard to raise her daughter right, making time to watch television together, creating rituals and connections in the middle of difficult circumstances. "Ma'am, you're doing what I didn't do. You're being present. Don't ever underestimate how important that is." The episode aired that night at 11:30 p.m., and NBC's switchboard lit up within 15 minutes. But the calls weren't complaints about the uncomfortable confession or demands for their regular scheduled entertainment. They were from parents thanking Carson for his honesty, from adult children crying because they'd felt unseen by their own successful fathers, from people who'd sacrificed relationships for careers and were just beginning to understand the cost. The network received over 5,000 calls that night, more than any other episode in The Tonight Show's history. Letters poured in for weeks, people sharing their own stories of regret, of choosing work over family, of realizing too late what actually mattered. But what viewers didn't see was the private aftermath that played out in the weeks following the broadcast. Carson's 3 sons, Christopher, Corey, and Richard, all called him after seeing the episode. The conversations weren't easy. There were decades of hurt and absence to work through, wounds that couldn't be healed with a single confession on television. Christopher, the oldest, was angry at first. "You can admit this to 20 million strangers, but you couldn't admit it to us?" But the anger was covering something deeper, a desperate hope that maybe, finally, his father was ready to try. The phone calls led to dinners, awkward at first, filled with long silences and careful conversations. But they were a start. Carson began declining some professional opportunities to spend time with his sons. He started therapy, something he'd always dismissed as unnecessary self-indulgence. He wrote letters, trying to articulate feelings he'd never expressed in person. The letters weren't eloquent, but they were honest attempts at connection from a man who'd spent his life avoiding emotional vulnerability. Richard later told a biographer that his father's letters were painful to read because they revealed how much Carson had been struggling all along, how the perfect television host was actually a deeply conflicted man who didn't know how to be a father, but desperately wished he did. Ed McMahon, in an interview years later, said that the April 8th episode changed Johnny in ways both obvious and subtle. He stopped treating the show like it was the most important thing in the world. Don't get me wrong, he was still professional, still brilliant. But there was a shift. He started seeing the audience as people, rather than as a mass to be entertained. He started asking crew members about their families. He remembered names, asked follow-up questions. It was like that little girl's question woke him up to the fact that there were actual human beings all around him, and they mattered more than the ratings or the reviews. Sarah Mitchell kept that phone number written on her palm for 3 days before carefully copying it into a notebook where it remained for the rest of her life. She never called it, feeling that the gift wasn't the number itself, but the gesture, the acknowledgement from someone famous that she, a 9-year-old girl from Glendale, mattered enough to be given access. But she carried the lesson from that night into everything she did. She became a child psychologist, specializing in helping parents connect with their children, using Carson's confession as evidence in therapy sessions that even the most successful people can fail at what matters most. She never monetized the moment, never wrote a tell-all book, never tried to leverage her connection to Carson for personal gain. She simply carried the truth forward. Success means nothing without presence. Carson continued hosting The Tonight Show for 7 more years after the April 8th episode, retiring in 1992 after 30 years as the undisputed king of late-night television. His final broadcast was watched by 50 million people. During that farewell show, Carson delivered a monologue thanking his audience, his crew, his guests. He didn't specifically mention April 8, 1985, but everyone who'd seen it remembered. When Carson talked about what The Tonight Show had meant to him, he said something that echoed that night 7 years earlier. "I hope I made you laugh, but more importantly, I hope I reminded you, at least occasionally, that we're all just people trying to figure this out, and it's okay to admit when we get it wrong." In his retirement, Carson was notably private, rarely giving interviews or making public appearances. But those close to him said he spent his final years rebuilding relationships with his sons, hosting them at his Malibu home, taking trips together, having the conversations he'd avoided for decades. It wasn't perfect. There was too much history, too much hurt for everything to be resolved neatly. But there was effort, presence, attempts at connection that Carson had never made before. Christopher Carson said in an interview after his father's death in 2005 that the last decade of Johnny's life was the first time he felt like he actually had a father, and while he wished they'd had more time, he was grateful for what they did have. The question remains, why did one 9-year-old girl's innocent question accomplish what decades of therapy, multiple divorces, and countless professional triumphs couldn't? Perhaps it was the timing. Carson was 59 years old in 1985, old enough to see the consequences of his choices playing out in real time. Perhaps it was the messenger, a child asking with genuine curiosity, no judgment or agenda. Perhaps it was simply that Carson was tired of performing, tired of being Johnny Carson the character, and Sarah's question gave him permission to stop. Or perhaps it was all of these things converging in one perfect moment of vulnerability where the truth could finally break through. What we know for certain is that on April 8, 1985, Johnny Carson stopped being the polished professional who dominated late-night television for over 2 decades and became something more valuable, honest. He admitted failure in a culture that demands success. He acknowledged regret in an industry that celebrates confidence. He showed vulnerability at a time when celebrities were expected to project invincibility. And in doing so, he gave permission to millions of viewers to examine their own lives, their own choices, their own regrets, about the balance between professional achievement and personal connection. The April 8th episode became a cultural touchstone, referenced in discussions about work-life balance, in parenting books about the importance of presence, in countless articles about redefining success. But beyond the cultural impact, beyond the think pieces and the television history books, the episode mattered because it was real. In a medium built on performance and artifice, Johnny Carson let his guard down and admitted he'd been getting it wrong. That admission didn't erase his failures or heal his relationships overnight. But it was a start, a public acknowledgement that the emperor had no clothes, that success, as measured by ratings and awards, was hollow without personal connection. Sarah Mitchell is in her late 40s now, still working as a child psychologist, still helping families navigate the complicated terrain of presence and connection. She occasionally tells the story of that night at The Tonight Show, using it to illustrate a simple truth that the most important questions are often the ones we're afraid to ask, and the most important answers are the ones that cost us something to give. She kept that Tonight Show coffee mug Carson's staff gave her, kept the notebook with his phone number, kept the memory of a night when a little girl asked a simple question and accidentally reminded America that success without relationships is just an expensive way to be alone. Johnny Carson was the king of late-night television, the most successful host in the history of the medium, a cultural icon who shaped American entertainment for 3 decades. But on April 8, 1985, he became something more important than successful. He became honest. And that honesty, uncomfortable and raw as it was, turned out to be his greatest legacy. Not the jokes or the interviews or the perfect timing that made millions laugh, but the willingness to admit, in front of 20 million viewers, that he'd spent his life prioritizing the wrong things. That admission gave permission to a generation of parents to choose differently, to value presence over achievement, to remember that at the end of your life, nobody asks about your job. They ask about whether you were there, whether you showed up, whether you loved well. Johnny Carson learned that lesson too late to fully repair the damage with his sons. But by admitting it publicly, by being vulnerable when everything in his industry told him to stay polished, he gave the rest of us a chance to learn it earlier. And that might be the greatest gift any entertainer has ever given their audience.